watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
I've read all of the books that you've both published, and I couldn't be on a stage with two people who've done more interesting and innovative things with historical sources in their fiction. The way we thought we'd begin this program is by giving each of these writers a chance to speak for a few minutes about how they came to write novels that draw heavily on historical sources and the choices they made while doing so. And then we'll have a conversation among the three of us and then open it up to questions. So Anna, do you want to begin with your remarks?
Sure. My novel, The Little Bride, is it's set in the 1880s, but it began in a very 21st century way. I was Googling myself one day, don't laugh, and I came upon another Anna Solomon, an Anna Solomon Freudenthal, on a website called Stories Untold, Jewish Women Pioneers. And I thought, Jewish women pioneers? I had no idea that such a category even existed. I quickly found out that this Anna Solomon and her husband had settled a little town of Solomonville, Arizona, where they ran the Solomon Hotel and the Solomon Ranch and the Solomon Store. And I also discovered other Jewish women on this website, including one named Rachel Bella Kaloff, who'd been a mail-order bride to North Dakota in the 1890s. And then my next thought was, Jewish pioneer mail-order bride? It was, and as it turned out, luckily for me and for many other people, Rachel Kaloff had written her story, which itself is actually quite an amazing story. She wrote it toward the end of her life. It was in the 1930s. She was living in Seattle by then, by way of North Dakota, then St. Paul, and then Seattle. And she wrote it, she passed away, it wound up stashed away for about 50 years until the 80s when one of her daughters discovered it. And then another 10 years passed, and in the 90s, her son found it and had it translated from the Yiddish. And so in 1995, about exactly 100 years after she had come from her small shtetl in Russia, Rachel Kaloff's story, as it's called as a book, was published by Indiana University Press. I'm guessing some of you in this audience tonight are familiar with it. It's a very stark and moving account of her experience as a mail-order bride, homesteading on the Great Plains. And it served for me as the inspiration for me to write my novel, The Little Bride, in particular one scene, which I'm guessing we'll get to later in talking about other things. So my book, The Little Bride, tells the story of Minna Losk. She's a 16-year-old orphan who makes her own journey from Odessa to America as a mail-order bride. She's fleeing an abusive boss. She's also fleeing the pogroms that are growing increasingly frequent and more violent. This is during the 1880s. And she imagines that her life will only get easier. She imagines herself married to a handsome man, living in a townhouse in New York City, perhaps. She imagines having access to running water. She has lots of fantasies. And instead, she gets off the boat at Castle Gardens, which was then the place where one disembarked, and to find herself beginning yet another journey, this time on a train bound for a place called So Dakota. That's South Dakota to you and me. This is just a few years before statehood and when they were still known as the Dakota Territories. She's engaged, it turns out, to a 40-year-old man named Max. 40's not very old, but remember she's 16, who is trying and mostly failing to farm a very stubborn, rocky piece of land in the middle of nowhere in South Dakota. And that's not all. He's rigidly Orthodox. Minna is barely observant. His first wife left almost as soon as she saw the sod hut that they were going to be living in. And he has two sons, Jacob and Samuel, one of whom, Samuel, Minna finds herself falling in love with. So that's the very basic premise of the book. If you want to know what happens, I hope you'll read it. One important thing that my research turned up was that Jewish immigrants, like Rachel Kalof's husband and like my character Max, they weren't usually heading west on their own. They were part of a movement that was called the Am Olam movement. It had its roots in Eastern Europe. And the leaders of Am Olam, basically, their basic belief was that the answer to anti-Semitism lay in getting out of the traditional Jewish vocations, businesses, small crafts, trading, and into farming. Their idea was that by owning land, by becoming more productive, more physically robust, more self-sufficient, the Jew would free himself or herself from anti-Semitic hatred and live in peace. And it was very idealistic. A lot of it came with sort of a socialist, agrarian piece as well. And along with it was also the idea that the appeal of space and distance that farming provided. So the notion that if Jews weren't crowded into shtetls anymore, they wouldn't be as easy to attack. Some Jewish groups at this time were heading east, of course, to Palestine, but the Am Olam adherents believed that the New World was their answer. And when you read their their manifestos, they talk about America as a kind of Eden. They use the word Eden a lot, and it's almost the agricultural version of the myth of the streets paved with gold. It was as if they would go out into the plains and they would sprinkle seeds, and the farm would just flourish in this way, which turned out not to be the case at all. What they might not have known in Eastern Europe was that in America, there were very practical reasons to support such a movement. There were so many Jews and other refugees flooding into eastern cities at this time. There wasn't enough housing, there weren't enough jobs, and it wasn't just a space problem either. For many of the wealthier, more assimilated Jewish Americans at the time, often these were German Jews whose families had been in the States for generations already. They'd been working hard to establish their reputations as upstanding, mostly secular, above all, sort of American Americans. And the newer immigrants were an embarrassment. They were poor, they were speaking Yiddish, they were holding on to their traditions, they were very observant. So while the wealthier Jews truly wanted to help the new immigrants, and they set up funds there, and that is a whole other kind of piece that we could get into. They set up, the Baron de Hirsch is sort of the most famous figure from this time. While they also saw Am Olam as a way to help themselves and their own reputations. And I was really interested in that dynamic as well. And I'm just gonna read briefly from a passage in which Max's younger son, Jacob, describes the Am Olam movement in his own words. So you can get a kind of sense of his attitude about it. In this scene, he and Minna are on the train. They're heading west. And Minna, as you'll see, still knows relatively little at this point about where she is headed. She doesn't even actually understand who Jacob really is. She still thinks that until this scene that he is someone who works for Max and has come to get her. So there are a lot of surprises that she's going to find out. When Minna finally woke, the train was passing through a woods so thick with ferns it looked bottomless. For a long moment, she couldn't say what continent she was on. Then she turned to see Jacob, smiling. "You're alive." He handed her a roll and a square of cheese. "We're past Pittsburgh. You missed it. Gorgeous, filthy place." "Where are we going?" "So Dakota. That way." He pointed ahead. "It's not the most cosmopolitan place, but there's plenty of land. Well, plenty of grass and rocks. Yes, I see you know all about it." He bent over his lap, removed a long blade of grass he'd tucked into one boot as if to demonstrate grass, then straightened back up. "Didn't they tell you anything?" "They? I don't know. Whoever Max rode off to. He's not a detail man, or at least he didn't tell us any details. Where you're coming from, for instance." "Odessa." Jacob let out a whistle. "City of thieves?" He set the grass between his teeth and let it bounce as he talked. "Well, I won't lie. Where we're going, in a word, it's not Odessa. You could call it a farm, but it's not really that yet either. We've got chickens, 1 horse, 1 cow, a mule who may or may not be alive by our return, a tool approximating a plow." Minna couldn't tell if he was joking. She couldn't imagine him a farmhand, though she could imagine him pretending to be. "How long have you worked for Max?" she asked. "Oh," again that slippery grin, "as long as I can remember." "And still the farm is not a farm? We've only been there 1 year. And before that?" "Well, in a word, we were just like you. Sailed into New York 2 years ago, hungry as dogs, then got sent to Cincinnati, where the rich old Jews liked us plenty. They housed us and fed us and gave us English lessons and jobs in a furniture factory. Very kind, the rich old Jews. But then people like us kept coming, and they weren't so happy anymore. Imagine their dilemma. Jacob drew in his chin and spoke in a booming voice. How will we teach so many all at once how to dress properly and clip their beards to a hygienic length and walk without their feet flopping and their heads in the sky and talk without their hands flailing and tell their women to stop looking every one like a widow? You can imagine. They'd worked so hard to prove that they weren't dirty Jews, and then here we were, thousands of dirty Jews. They sent us out into the towns, in a word. But some who were willing, they sent further. Jacob raised a finger. As a farmer, he mimicked, even a Jew can be free. He can build a new Palestine. He laughed. Am Olam, they called us, eternal people, as if the name would be enough to sell us on the scheme. Well, it was. The rich old boys, backed by the richest of them all, the Baron de Vintovich himself, the man who's concocted the whole mess, they gave us money for tools and food for the first year, though Max only took half of what they offered. He's proud? It was the only question Minna could think to ask, though the answer, she understood, was beside the point. Jacob wasn't joking. They were headed for a farm, or not even a farm. Proud, yes, and suspicious. Most of us who joined were sent to colonies like Bethlehem, Yehuda, New Jerusalem. There's even a new Odessa. But good old Max thought it couldn't be a good idea, so many Jews crammed together all over again, so he decided to go it alone. Did you want to go to a colony, Minna asked. Of course. Then why stay with him? A look of despair crossed Jacob's face. Well, in a word, actually, he winced. Max is my father. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trick you. Oh, it's not funny anymore, I know. Maybe it wasn't ever funny. Samuel says I'm never funny, actually. Who's Samuel? My brother. He might have come for you. He's older, and most say smarter, and better looking too, nose like a Roman. But he's also the only one of us with half a wit about the farm. Minna said nothing. It was hard to tell if the train had sped up or her blood had slowed down. So I'll stop there, but it gives you a little taste. Thanks.
My field is in Jewish languages, in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And one of the things that I've tried to do in all my novels is that what I've realized is that we have sort of an unusual situation in the United States, in that here we have one of the largest Jewish communities in world history, but this is a community that's unusual in Jewish history, though not unique, in that this is a community that doesn't primarily use a Jewish language. This is a community that primarily uses English. And what I've tried to do in each of my novels is to write in English as though English were a Jewish language. And what I mean by that is I try to write novels where the language of the novel itself is drawn from Jewish sources, and to some extent the plot is also drawn from Jewish sources. So that's something I've done in each of my books. But I want to speak mostly this evening about my, I guess no longer my most recent novel, but my most recent published novel, which is All Other Nights, which is a novel about Jewish spies in the Civil War. And I wrote this book because in confronting this question about Jewish languages, which is something that I've thought a lot about in my academic work, I realized that there's sort of a deeper problem in the American Jewish community, which is that this is a community that's constantly worried about authenticity. I think there's this sense that our life and culture here is somehow inauthentic, that American Jewish culture is just sort of a fly-by-night, half-baked version of some real Jewish culture that took place in some old country somewhere. But of course, as every person in this room knows, this is very far from the case. And I was interested in exploring those aspects of American Jewish history that are often not explored in fiction, very much as Anna has, although perhaps for different reasons. And one of the things that interested me was that you have American and Jewish culture are two cultures that share a lot of things. Perhaps most importantly, the trust in the rule of law. But these are also two cultures that have almost completely opposite views of time and of personal identity. In America, we have this myth that you can be a self-made man or a self-made woman without a past, that it doesn't matter who your parents are or who your grandparents are, but what matters is what you do with the opportunities this country presents to you and what you make of your future, and it's your future that matters. And this is, of course, this myth that we call the American dream. In Jewish culture, of course, we have the opposite myth. The foundational myth of personal and collective identity in Judaism is this idea that when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai to the Israelites, that it wasn't just that generation of Israelites that was present at Mount Sinai, but that all of the descendants of that generation of Israelites were also present at Mount Sinai to receive the word from God in person. So if you think about it, this myth is actually the opposite of the American dream. Because what this myth is saying is that, in fact, it does matter who your parents are. It matters who your parents' parents were. It matters who your parents' parents' parents were. And the most important thing in your life happened thousands of years before you were born, and there's nothing you can do about it. So this is, in fact, exactly the opposite of the American dream. So one of the things I wanted to do in writing this novel was to create a kind of an American Jewish founding legend that would accommodate both of these myths, and to do that in an American Jewish language. And in that process, I found my way back to this subject about Jews in the Civil War. Today it's, of course, very common to have friends and relatives in different parts of the country. There probably is not a single person in this room for whom that isn't true. But in 1860, when most Americans were small farmers farming the same plot of land their parents had farmed, it actually was relatively rare to have friends and relatives in other parts of the country, except among American Jews. And the reason for this was, as many of you know, was because American Jews mostly had come to this country from places where they hadn't been allowed to own land for many centuries. So when they came here, they were not so much creating farms as they were creating businesses. And no matter how small your business is, you always need to have a business network. You need a supplier, you need a distributor, you need a way to get goods and services from one place to another. So what many families did when they came to this country is that they would send one member of the family to one city and another member to another in order to create these kinds of business networks. So what happened when the country divided at the time of the Civil War is that you had Jewish communities on the north and in the south, and unlike many of their neighbors, they were often able to sympathize with people on the other side because, unlike many of their neighbors, they actually knew people on the other side. And it was that I found very resonant about this history. I actually am I'm actually of the opinion that there's really no such thing as historical fiction in the purest sense. And what I mean by that is that I think that every historical novel is really about the time in which it's being written, not about the time in which it supposedly takes place. I think this is actually also probably, many of you might agree, is true for history writing as well, in a different kind of way, although, and perhaps not as openly. But I think that that's very true for historical novels, and for me, it was very true in writing this novel. I was drawn to this period to writing about this period during the Civil War because of how polarized the country has become now. By how impossible it's become to even talk to anyone about current events without knowing in advance what the other person believes, or being willing to get into a fight, which many people are obviously very willing to do. What I realized first was that many of those divisions within the country actually go back to the Civil War. When we talk about red states and blue states, they tend to follow the Mason-Dixon line and its legacies. But I also found that, in those conversations within the Jewish community, it always feels that the stakes in those kinds of conversations are even higher. There's a sense that these things matter even more and are even more urgent, whether that's true or not. And what I discovered in reading about Jewish communities at this time of the Civil War was something that felt very strangely familiar to me. And it was because of that familiar quality that I decided to pursue this novel. I hope we'll have a chance to discuss this more, but I don't feel that I'm writing history. I feel that I'm writing a novel that happens to be taking place in the past. And one thing I can say is when I first started writing this book, when I would tell people that I was writing a novel about Jewish spies during the American Civil War, very often I was asked this question: were there even Jews in America during the Civil War? Which, as every person in this room hopefully knows, not only is the answer yes, but actually one of them was featured on the Confederate $2 bill. And if you don't believe me, I actually have one right here. Because I think I'm the only woman in America to have received this particular gift for Mother's Day. Because cash always fits and it's always the right color, although in this case it's pink. And so obviously the answer, and if you can use this as your opportunity to come up and meet me afterwards, since there's no way I'm passing this around the room, because now it's worth a little bit more than $2. And at the time it was worth a whole lot less than $2. I should say that the person who's featured on this Confederate $2 bill is Judah Benjamin, who is a character in my novel, and I'm going to read a little bit of the piece I'm going to read from the novel is the moment when we first meet him in the book. There are many characters in the book who are based on real historical figures from American Jewish history, but to me, this was he was really a fascinating figure. For anyone who doesn't know sort of the very brief outline of his life, he was born in the Caribbean, and he came to the Carolinas at the age of 2. He was a child prodigy. He was admitted to Yale Law School at the age of 14. And if you're wondering how anybody could be admitted to Yale Law School at the age of 14, I think the people at Yale also were wondering, because he was expelled from Yale Law School at the age of 16. And at that point, he went to New Orleans and began his meteoric rise in his political career. He was elected to the United States Senate he was on the verge of being nominated for the United States Supreme Court when the southern states seceded from the Union. He then became the Confederacy's Attorney General, then their Secretary of War, later their Secretary of State, and eventually he was one of their spy masters, which is a role you see him playing in this book. I should say that Judah Benjamin, when the Confederacy collapsed, he managed a phenomenal escape that would never be convincing in fiction. First, he disguised himself, and some of you may know this story perhaps better than I do, and will unfortunately know the parts which surely can't possibly be true. First, he disguised himself as a Frenchman, and he hired a Jewish friend of his to act as his interpreter, to pose as his interpreter. And then he managed to travel with this man all the way to the Florida border before his interpreter abandoned him. At which point he started traveling through the swamps of Florida, traveling at night and sleeping in the swamps during the day so as not to be discovered. At one point he's sleeping in a swamp in Florida when he sees a parrot in a tree above his head. And the parrot speaks to him and says, "Hi, from Jefferson Davis. Hi, from Jefferson Davis." Figuring that a person who had taught their parrot to say, "Hi, from Jefferson Davis," might be someone who would be sympathetic to his plight, he took a rock and threw it at this parrot to get it out of its tree, realizing that it was a very well-trained parrot. He then followed this parrot home to the home of a farmer who, of course, was a passionate Confederate sympathizer, knew exactly who Judah Benjamin was, and happily sheltered him in his tool shed for the following week. After which, he put him on a boat headed for the Florida Keys. That boat was boarded by U.S. Marshals looking for Judah Benjamin. The people on the boat then disguised him as the boat's Jewish cook, complete with a yarmulke and soot all over his face. And he actually was face-to-face with the U.S. Marshal looking for him. And the Marshal only commented that he had never before seen a Jewish cook on a ship. At that point, when he got to the Florida Keys, he boarded a ship that was bound for Bimini in the Caribbean. At that point, the ship got caught in a water spout, which is like when you have almost like a tornado that hits the ocean. The ship was destroyed. He managed to survive on a smaller vessel, which unfortunately this smaller vessel was filled with a cargo of sponges, which had taken in water during the storm, causing them to expand to the point where the boat actually exploded. Judah Benjamin is now hanging on a board in the Caribbean Sea. While he's hanging on this board, he comes across a rowboat occupied by 3 African-American refugees. The boat, when he gets into this boat is then submerged up to 5 inches of the edge of the boat. 1 oar, 30 miles to Nassau. They make it. When they make it to Nassau, Judah Benjamin obviously is extremely relieved to be boarding an actual steamship bound for Southampton in England. Do I even need to tell you that a week after they leave Nassau, the ship caught fire, runs aground in St. Thomas? Eventually, he does make it to England, and in England, he, of course, then creates for himself an entirely successful second career, where he's admitted to the British bar, becomes a British barrister, rises to the level of Queen's Counsel, and writes a textbook on British commercial law that's still required reading in British law schools to this day. So this is obviously a typical Jewish guy who could pretty much do pretty much anything that his parents felt that he could do. But what I find most interesting about him, though, is that he was absolutely hated, both in the North and in the South. He was constantly being excoriated in the press and in person. But what was fascinating to me was that when you read accounts of this, there are many accounts of him being insulted on the Senate floor and in the press. Every time he was insulted, and I'm talking about really explicitly anti-Semitic insults, he never would respond to the person who insulted him. Instead, he would just smile. And it's this smile that you see, first of all, immortalized on the Confederate $2 bill. But that smile, to me, said a tremendous amount about what it meant to be Jewish in public life at that time. Benjamin was actually descended from Sephardic Jews who were in the Caribbean after having fled, had fled Spain and Portugal and then been in Brazil and had gone to the Caribbean. And what I noticed in looking at his life is that this was you had this sort of heritage where this was a community that had been dissimilating. in Spain while facing the Inquisition. And what I realized as I looked at Judah Benjamin's work as a spy master for the Confederacy was that Jews have historically had a lot of experience as double agents. There's a scene in my novel that takes place in the Sephardic congregation in Richmond, which since has in Jewish American tradition merged with the Ashkenazi Jewish congregation in Richmond. But there's a scene that takes place in this congregation, and while my main character is there, he looks around at these Sephardic Jews, and he says that he realizes that this was a community that had this historical experience of acting as double agents, pretending to serve one master while actually serving another. And there's a lot of imagery in my novel about the theater. There's several characters who are actors. There's obviously about spies, about passing, about people speaking in code. And I drew a lot of that from the lives of Judah Benjamin and other American Jews at the time, because I saw that that was what it took to be Jewish in public life, but also because it felt to me, again, very familiar. Not that we faced any of the kinds of challenges that those people faced, but that we now live in a culture where, in a sense, everyone is living a public life. And everything that you do is you're constantly creating an image for yourself that you're putting on display. And you have to constantly think about the consequences of that image for the community and for the community that you represent and for the way that you're viewed in your life in this world. And so these are some of the things I thought about in writing this book. As I said, I don't see it as a historical novel. I see it as a novel that takes place in the past. And in a sense, I think that the reason is because you have this internal divide that's within, a divide that goes within American life and happens to also go within Jewish life, which is between this sort of supreme Jewish value and a supreme American value of an attachment to tradition at all costs. And then you have this supreme Jewish value and supreme American value of attachment to justice and equality at all costs. And you see the tension between those values, which continues to this day. And so, but at the same time that this novel is very much a potboiler about the Civil War. So the part I'm going to read to you takes place, it's near the beginning of the book, when my main character, Jacob Rappaport, who's a Jewish soldier in the Union Army, whose commanders have discovered that he has an uncle in New Orleans who's involved in a plot to assassinate Lincoln. And his commanders then send him to New Orleans to assassinate his uncle before the plot can progress. After this rather unpleasant mission, they give him another, quote, opportunity, this time involving the daughter of a Virginia family friend. When he objects that he doesn't feel comfortable assassinating a woman, they tell him, well, we don't want you to murder her, we want you to marry her. Of course, this marriage doesn't work out the way anyone expects. But the passage I'm going to read to you now is about when Jacob goes to assassinate his uncle. His mission actually takes place where he shows up as an uninvited guest at a Passover Seder in New Orleans. And his uncle is actually a cousin of Judah Benjamin, who also ends up appearing at this Seder. So that's just a very brief passage I'm going to read, is when the first time Judah Benjamin appears in the book. Jacob wondered if there could be anything stranger than sitting down to a Passover Seder, the Feast of Freedom, with every part of the meal served by slaves. But that was exactly what happened at the home of Harry Hyams. It was a good thing that most of the service was in Hebrew, because it was far more comfortable without the slaves listening. Though there were more than enough awkward passages about freedom that Harry read proudly in English from his seat at the table's head. The limping slave who had answered the door, along with a Negro woman, were the ones who carried the platters of matzah and bitter herbs in and out of the dining room, while the guests sang the Hebrew hymns thanking God for freeing them from bondage. The others avoided eye contact with the slaves who delivered their food and dishes, but Jacob decided to look at them each time. The woman avoided his gaze, but the man glared back at him with a look of strange and vicious triumph. It frightened Jacob even more than Harry did. He looked away until his uncle asked him, "Jacob, as the youngest person at the table, would you do us the honor of asking the 4 questions?" Jacob tried to hide his grimace beneath a grin. It was the child's part of the service, the part he had recited at his parents' table since he was 3 years old. But now the nature of the opening question sickened him. Everyone was watching him, and he had no choice. With a crack in his voice, he began to sing the words, trying not to imagine what they might mean. How is this night different from all other nights? Fortunately, he did not have to think about the answer very long, because a moment later, Judah Benjamin entered the room, and everyone stood. Every Hebrew in America was fascinated by Judah Benjamin. Southern Hebrews saw him as the messenger of the Messiah, the herald who would proclaim liberty throughout the land to anyone who had ever felt that Jewish fear of power. Northern Hebrews saw him as the beginning of a descent into an American Jewish hell, and whispered at Friday night tables that if the Confederacy were to prevail, the rot of centuries would eat through even the freshness of America, and the Jews would be blamed again. After poring over all the information the officers had given him to read in preparation for his mission, Jacob found that his every thought about Judah Benjamin made him ill at ease, and it was only many years later that he was able to understand why. Judah Benjamin was a queer American genius, one who had achieved nothing through birth and everything through self-transformation. His entire life was an elaborate refusal to be the person he had been born to be. The problem was that it was all a facade. He was a lawyer without ever having finished law school, a planter who knew so little about farming that he traveled to France to learn about seeds, a patriarch of a Catholic family who would never dream of believing that Jesus was a god, a man married into the Southern aristocracy whose wife and child had permanently moved to Paris. And everybody who looked at him remarked that they'd never seen such a Jewish face.
So thank you both so much. The question I'd ask is what, as people who clearly like to read history or enjoy the reading of history, what seems to you valuable about creating fictional narratives on subject where we have non-fictional sources? In other words, if a historian can write, and not that they always do, but a compelling narrative, as compelling as the one that you told about Judah Benjamin, what is at stake in inventing fictional characters to place within a historical narrative? What do you think that allows you to do that the historians can't?
Well, okay. Okay. Well, as I said, I don't really. It's true that, like, I mean, if you could just write this in a nonfiction way, and it would just be like, it would be Eli Evans' biography of Judah Benjamin, right. Like, that would be fun, but, like, he kind of already did that. But I think that, honestly, my answer is that I don't really see myself as writing history. I don't find it, I mean, what I try to do is, in my novels, I try to be very accurate, because I find, first of all, because I'm a dork, and I know that, like, when something's wrong in a book, like, it really bothers you, and you're just like, you totally discredit everything that person says when you find, like, the first error. And as true as that is for, and I had known that even, my previous novels dealt with, like, my last novel deals with Yiddish writers in the 20th century. And I was so careful to get all these details right, and it was only after the book was published where I was like, nobody's going to know whether Der Nister was executed in 1950 or 1951. I'm the only person who's going to notice that. But the problem is when you write a book about the Civil War, I mean, if this battle started at 9 o'clock instead of 10 o'clock, you're going to have, like, hundreds of people who jump down your throat. And they're all coming, and they come, like, wearing costumes, which is another astonishing thing. I mean, this has been an amazing experience promoting a book about the Civil War. But I think that, actually, I was very careful to get the details right in this novel, because, I mean, as some readers have pointed out, I mean, while the details are very accurate, at least I tried to make them accurate, the plot is, let's say, not particularly realistic. I see plot as a way of expressing belief in fiction. By creating these sort of out-of-proportion events, you can create a kind of legendary quality where your characters have an opportunity to demonstrate choices that real people make on a much smaller scale every day. So, for example, you have this in this novel, this idea of this person who's really, he's asked to assassinate his own uncle in order to prove his loyalty to his country. Did this ever happen? As far as I know, no. It would be really cool if it did, and I would have written a book about that. But as far as I know, it didn't. But what you do see, though, is the choices that many American Jews at that time had to make all the time, which was smaller decisions about loyalty to a family versus a country. It's a decision that every person made every time they changed their name. It's a choice that every person made every time they decided where to live, decided what community they wanted to be, and decided how they wanted to dress. All these kinds of choices are much less dramatic, but that's why. But in a novel, you have this opportunity, or in fiction, you have this opportunity to create this kind of legendary scale where you can dramatize these events in a way that brings them into a new perspective that you couldn't possibly have if you were writing history.
Yeah, I agree with that, and in some ways that there's a way in which fiction, I mean, it exaggerates in a way. It exaggerates what we all know and live. And a lot of what Dara was saying before, especially the feeling of sort of writing about now, writing about whatever time you are in, even if you happen to be writing about the past, I think is true in that way as well, that we're working out a lot of the conflicts that Jews in America and just people live through now, and setting them in motion through plot that's set at a different time, that has a totally different context. The other piece I'd say that I think is just, and it's very simple, but fiction allows us into the interior lives of the characters in a way that I think historical narrative can't to the same degree. Because in a way, you can't ever know what that historical person what that historical figure was thinking. You can make it up in fiction, and then it becomes a truth.
When you're writing about biblical figures, there isn't this idea that there's this real person there that that you're then, whether or not you're true to the actual Moses or not is not an important question in a lot of ways, and it wasn't even an important question to the rabbis or to earlier Jewish sages. But that's one thing I do feel conscious about, though, in writing historical fiction, where I have characters who are a little closer in time to ours, where I feel like you are inhabiting someone else's mind where they had that mind, and that really, there was a real person there, and are you displacing the actual person by creating this fictional character? That's something that I do struggle with in my work. I have, in my next novel, I have Solomon Schechter as a character in my next novel. Rambam's also a character in my next novel, which is very risky. But I worry about creating a mind for someone who really did exist and really did have their own consciousness. But I think that the way to do it is to think about the way that Midrash is done, that it isn't about it's not about trying to create a more accurate version of who Moses really was. You're doing something entirely different. You're not trying to write history. You're trying to draw a different kind of idea or belief out of a story, out of an older story.
One of the things in Rachel Kaloff's story that actually started me writing this book was a line very early on. She's talking about the inspection, the examination she was given back in Eastern Europe to become a mail order bride. It was called her look. And she doesn't describe it in great detail, but what she says is, "They inspected me like a horse." This is the line. And it was one of those lines that says so much and also says very little. And I think, so for me, what fiction can do is enter in that space between and fill it in and imagine and build compassion. And I think there are many roles for it in that way as well. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It strikes me that psychological interiority is one of the things that I look for in fiction that I don't look for in history. It's noteworthy that in this latest novel and in your novel, Anna, there's no contemporary frame. There's not a sense of and I can think of half a dozen novels where someone's working on a historical project and they discover a memoir, and thus half of the book is the invented memoir of someone in history. And I'm curious if you can speak to why you would not choose to impose that sort of contemporary frame. What's lost in it seems appealing in certain ways. It was certainly appealing at the beginning in the first couple of books you wrote, and I think in a general sense it's quite appealing. But neither of these books chose that, and I wonder if you can think about what would have been lost if you invented a contemporary character who was discovering the history of Jacob Rappaport or discovering the history of Menelaus as a vehicle for your own sort of research and experience.
I did not set out, I wasn't thinking, I'm going to write a historical novel or I'm going to write a Jewish novel. It really was, I was actually working on a different book that was set in contemporary times, and this story just came and got me and took me back there. So I don't think it was as much a choice in that way. I think there is something very appealing about the idea, and perhaps even a little safe about the idea of having there be a frame or having there be I don't know that I'd call it a stigma, but the questions that, sort of the genre of historical fiction, and it's put in a different place than literary fiction. And I think that there's a way in which it can feel as if you have that frame, then you're kind of you're more within the realm of literary fiction, because you've done something contemporary, and you've provided an awareness that this isn't fully historical fiction. So I think, and when I say safe, I wonder about that as well.
From a marketing perspective.
Yeah, and from a sense of like how something is received, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting that you said you were working on something else. This novel also, I started with a frame, which I didn't realize that was what I was starting with. But then what happened was, when I first started writing this novel, and this shows you how little I plan my books. I started writing this novel, and actually the proposal I sold to the publisher for this novel was that it was supposed to be a novel about an imagined friendship between Mark Twain and Shalom Aleichem. So it came a long way from there. But what the premise of that, and feel free to write this novel yourself if you want, because I tried and I failed, and everyone's like, oh, well, then it could be your fourth book. And it's like, well, if it didn't work for my third book, why would it work for my fourth book? Feel free to take this idea and run with it if you're interested. Because what happened was I realized that when I got to the point where I was writing a third novel, that often when I read a book that I love, a novel that I love, I go back and try to find other novels about that same author. And usually it works for the first two books, and by the time I get to the third book, I'm immensely disappointed because I feel like this author's writing the same book again and again. I remember that happening to me when I was 14 years old with Chaim Potok. And I remember reading, I read The Chosen, I'm like, this is great. I read The Promise, this is great. And I get to the next, Asher Lev or something. I'm like, I wonder if this will be about like a disaffected boy in an Orthodox community who decides that he has to find some way to move beyond this stifled intellectual world, but that he still feels this sense of faith pulling him back. And I'm like, well, it is, right? And I thought to myself, like, I could be that person. There are worse fates in life to be Chaim Potok. So on the other, that I've now since realized that, which is why I'm going back to that way of writing the same book over and over again. I'm like, that's what people like. I should write it again. But the truth is, I set this as a challenge for myself because I thought to myself, I want to see if I can write a novel that is from one character's point of view, one place, one time, the same plot all the way through. It isn't one place, it's more than one place, but it's the linear plot. And one of the reasons I did that was because I felt like there's sort of this crutch in contemporary fiction, as you put it, I think it's true, where you don't need to have a plot because every time you don't know what's going to happen next, you're like, oh, let's just set the next chapter in the Middle Ages, right? And then it distracts people and they don't realize that you're not reading a book with a plot. This is a device I frequently use. And so I really wanted to avoid that crutch.
I was talking to someone about the presence of historical fiction in various Jewish traditions, and actually in the American Yiddish novel tradition, you get the fully realized 19th century historical novel in the Lukácsian sense, in Opatoshu, in Ash, in Yud Yud Singer especially.
Yeah.
Yud Yud Singer is really the guy who mastered that form in Yiddish, and those dispense with any sense of that framing that you get in those smaller and in the classic era, like in the earlier moments. So it's an interesting.
The literature is more developed. Once
right.
the literature is more developed, you have the confidence to write something that doesn't have that kind of frame.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay. One thing I would say also though is just that I do think that there is a frame in this novel and in my other novels, which is that in a sense the historical story is a frame around an older Jewish story.
Right.
Like this story is a rewriting of the story of Jacob from the Torah.
Right.
And that I see that, in other words, the historical frame is still a frame around an older story.
So last year, about a year ago, the judges of the Wallant Award, which you've won, published a piece sort of surveying their experience judging this prize for basically debut or emerging Jewish writing. And they noted that, quote, at no time before have Jewish writers in America turned so uniformly to history, end quote. So I think there's actually room to disagree about that in certain ways. It depends on how you define your terms. But they suggest an interpretation of that. I want to suggest three interpretations of that have been given, one by myself. So those judges say they explain that turn to history with one point by the impact of Sebalt's writing on American Jewish writers, which is very interesting. And also, they credit it to a growing fascination with the construction and transmission of historical narratives among a generation of Jews with an ever more attenuated connection to the events of the Holocaust. So the idea is that as American Jews get further from this sort of signal historical event, they have to be thinking more historically, or they're forced to be thinking more historically. William Dershowitz wrote in The Nation in a review of a couple of novels by Michael Chabon and Nathan Englander, quote, the most visible of the current generation of self-consciously Jewish novelists appear to be avoiding their own experience because their own experience just seems too boring. What is there to say about it? Better to write about a time or place where there was more at stake, end quote. So that's the sort of vicariousness argument that there's not enough interesting going on in contemporary Jewish life to base a novel around it, so that thus the turn to history. And then here's what I wrote about it, or here's what I had to say about it. Basing my work on another literary scholar who's pointed out the sort of pervasive and increasing impact of the culture of the schooling of creative writing in American writing generally. The point is that our writers tend to be more and more educated than they ever were, in a sense. That while Dara, you don't have an MFA, you have a PhD, which is, in a sense, even more.
Worse.
And
Even worse.
And there's a way in which what I suggest is, where I got my PhD at Michigan, the MFA students get research grants. They get automatic research grants to do research. And if someone's giving you an automatic research grant, it seems like you're going to go do some research. You're not going to just sit and write a novel about what happened last week with your girlfriend. So my suggestion is simply that, especially as the creative writing system becomes more and more institutionalized, and as I say in the piece, a novel is now more likely to be a credential for tenure than to reach a wide audience of readers for many kinds of creative writers. It's not surprising that novelists look a little bit more like literary scholars and historians than they ever did before. I'm not saying that that's right, I'm just saying that that's what I wrote. So I'm curious, I'm curious what you think, if you look around and you see a focus on the past in the writing that your peers are doing, if any of these explanations make sense to you, if none of these explanations make sense to you, if you have your own feeling about why we can find so much of the creative writing being done now, especially by Jewish writers in America, focusing on past events.
I'm not sure about your explanation, only because I don't actually feel like most of my peers who graduated from my MFA program are writing or were encouraged to write about anything. We certainly didn't have any research grants. I do think that the second point about sort of, well, what is the Jewish American, well, it's not interesting enough now. You can look back at Philip Roth or Bernard Malamud, people who were expressing, who were seen both as writing amazing fiction on its own, but also expressing as representative of something. Oh, this is of the post-war generation. This is of this time period. It's hard to say what we are of, in a way, if we are not from, if we're not of those groups. So I think there is that element in a way, and I think it becomes much more personal.
My next novel is about a Jewish software executive who's kidnapped in Egypt. So I would say that that's fairly contemporary plot, and very much and hopefully not terribly boring, despite being a contemporary plot. So I disagree that American Jews are automatically leading boring lives or something like this, even if you're not being kidnapped in Egypt. I think there's, but what I would say is actually I think that part of it is what is exciting about contemporary life is part of the challenge or the problem with contemporary life for people our age. I'm guessing we're all kind of around the same generation. I'm 35. Is that we now live in a world where there's sort of this hyper present, where that what matters is where you are right now. What are you doing right now? And that's what you're posting online and this kind of thing. And there's this sort of hyper present, and there's sort of this erasure of the past, this sort of constant erasure of the past. And I think that literature is one of the few sort of public spaces where you're able to explore the past in a way that isn't, in a way that makes sense and is, in the absence of, a public culture that's willing to discuss the past. So that's what I don't think it's that contemporary life is too boring. In a sense, I think it's that contemporary life is in a sense too obsessed with the present. So that's one thing I would say. And another thing I would say is that when you think about authors like Philip Roth or Bernard Malamud, who were writing very much drawing from their own experiences, one of the things that I often found frustrating in reading those authors when I was growing up was that I found their work very thin in the sense that they felt to me there was something. I mean, it's like, to call these great writers shallow is not the right word, but there's something in their experience that felt disconnected from a larger literary tradition. And the idea that these were considered these sort of great Jewish writers, to me, always didn't feel right, because in a sense, these were writers who were not, they were great immigrant writers in a sense, but there's something in their work that wasn't, except for somebody like Cynthia Ozick, there are very few people of that generation who were drawing on a greater Jewish tradition that moved beyond sort of the contemporary experience of immigration, assimilation, these kinds of things. So that was something that I think that you sort of now have the room to explore in fiction. I also would disagree that there's sort of this glut of historical fiction. I think what there is a glut of Holocaust fiction. And that's perhaps a totally different subject. But one of the things that troubles me about that is that as a novelist, and one of the reasons I tend to avoid that as a novelist is that there's a kind of a moral certainty that you have in writing about the Holocaust, which in a sense is, while there's difficult things about writing about that period, there's something easy about it in that you sort of have this, you sort of have these moral certainties that are there that you don't need to create for your reader. And so that's something that troubles me about the sort of the glut of Holocaust fiction, which I do think does exist among younger contemporary writers.
Yeah.
Cynthia Uzick was very important to me in terms of discovering her. When I was younger, I remember being very frustrated by American Jewish literature because of what I felt like was this sort of thinness in it, which I referred to before, sort of not that these people weren't great writers, but that they weren't people who were drawing on a knowledge of this tradition, and I sort of, which would be okay, which wouldn't have bothered me, except that these were sort of being sold as like, this is the great American Jewish writers, and I was sort of like, well, that's always kind of sad, because these are people who didn't, who weren't sort of speaking to the same tradition as earlier sort of, great Jewish writers who had been working in Jewish languages. So Cynthia Uzick, I remember discovering her and being like, oh my God, it's someone who knows something, and being kind of astonished, like this is allowed. Like you're allowed to write about these, you're allowed to like, quote the Mishnah, and not pretend that it's like some, and not put it in italics. Like this is an astonishing thing for me to discover, but also the sort of moral seriousness of her work and the way that she, not just, and when I say the moral seriousness of it, what I mean is her interest in, her awareness that imaginative writing, in a sense, was a kind of idolatry, and in that way was a problem, was a religious problem. And when I say that, I don't mean, religious in a sort of like, I observe all the halacha kind of way, but in a religious sense that you're aware that you as the artist are supposed to be a creator. And there's this idea in Western culture of this, the artist as being almost like a quasi-religious figure and creating this world out of nothing. And in Judaism, you have this sort of idea of the limitations of the artist. And that was, and if creative work as being something that's collectively done, not something that's individually done. In terms of just what works I enjoy, I mean, really almost anything. I mean, I read a lot of contemporary fiction. I do read a lot of historical fiction. Actually, I tend to read a lot of historical fiction. I tend to reread books. This is something I've been doing lately, and maybe it's just because I had a baby 4 weeks ago and I don't have the energy to like follow a plot that I don't already know. And I'm like, who are these characters? I don't remember who this person was. It's 2 a.m. I have no idea who this guy is. But I do read, I was rereading Death of Ivan Ilyich. I was rereading a lot of the Russian literature that I read in high school and in college because, I sort of, the beautiful thing about that, which is something you learn really from reading the Torah every week if you're a person who does that, is that, the book doesn't change, but you do. And there's this beauty that I've only discovered as I, now as at 35, discovering that, you can reread things that you read when you were 20, and it's not the same book that you read when you were 20, even though hypothetically it's the same book, but it really isn't. So that's been a wonderful thing to discover.
I wonder too, though. I mean, I think it makes sense that there are these different models of Jewish writing in terms of someone like Uzick who is working within these traditions and very aware of them, and as you said, someone who knows something. But I think it's important too to recognize that there are different ways of knowing, because someone like, because we've been talking about him again, but someone like Roth or someone like, nothing's coming into my head at the moment, but it's not there. It seems like the way that they are knowing and the way that they're expressing to me is, although they're not directly addressing the history of Jewish writing or of Jewish tradition, all the knowledge, history is in them. That's where it's coming out, and it's in their character, it's in their emotion, it's in all the things that make them see the world in the way that they do. So I think there still is a way in which history is very present in those books, and in the way in which Jewish storytelling is very present in those books. It's done in it's a different way of doing it and a different way of knowing, I guess.
And I think it gets back to something you said at the very beginning of I think your own remarks, which is that difference what you find as a truth in fiction that's different from a kind of accuracy. And to my mind, when I think of what Roth knows in a way that is so different from what I love about Ozik's fiction, it's that Roth's dialogue sounds to me sort of precisely the way people speak and think, whereas Ozik so often sounds to me so wonderfully not like anyone I've ever spoken to.
Yes.
And that's those are different kinds of truth, and it doesn't make me like Cynthia Ozik any less, but it's a different kind of interaction with the real.
But Roth to me sounds like exactly the way people spoke 40 years ago.
Well,
that
right,
to me is
exactly,
what's interesting about it, is the historical quality of it.
Right, that it catches a moment. You're right.
I could read you just a paragraph, which is actually more like, it's more like a joke, actually, but it's sort of a joke of this kind of language. And this is in that same scene where this character shows up at his aunt and uncle's house in New Orleans there's this Passover Seder, and he knows that he's going to assassinate this, his uncle, and this is before his uncle comes home and he's meeting with his aunt. So this is sort of the kind of thing I'm talking about, but it's almost a caricature of the kind of thing I'm talking about. A real man, Jacob had learned during the past year, is one who excels at concealing emotions, succeeding in pretense. So this is when his aunt is so happy to see him, and he, of course, knows that he's about to kill her husband. He looked down at the hole in Elizabeth's shoe with his lips pursed, in an attitude of what he hoped would come across as modestly hidden pride. He used this opportunity to create a small fantasy in which he escaped to the kitchen and delivered the contents of his stomach into the nearest bucket. He reenacted this fantasy in his head several times as Elizabeth spoke of each of her 4 sons. Dear Henry, the brilliant one, whose letters were full of arcane discussions of what was permitted by military law. Richard, the wicked one, who was always running into trouble with the ladies, and whose letters consisted of nothing but jokes. Tom, who always saw the world in such a simple and innocent way, and who was now recuperating from some sort of injury to his hand. He hadn't answered her questions about the nature of the wound, but he had sounded so cheerful in his letters that she couldn't imagine it was anything serious. And Charles, the youngest and the sweetest, who never asked anything of anyone, and from whom she hadn't heard since the winter, when he had written to say that he was being stationed somewhere in Virginia. What expert pretenders his cousins were, Jacob thought. Henry and Richard with their letters full of distractions and jokes, and Tom, who was likely hiding the fact that he had lost an arm. And as for Charles, Jacob had been in Virginia that winter too. At one point, after a skirmish in Drainesville, he had retreated through a field strewn with enemy corpses, tripping over the bodies of boys. Perhaps he had even killed Charles himself. So that's like I said, kind of a caricature of it, but it's this sort of because I think it's something that you see in these older Jewish sources where there's almost every line is sort of an allusion to an earlier Jewish source. Whether it's ironically, consciously, not consciously. And this is something Deborah had asked about what else we read. I also read a lot of contemporary Israeli literature. And in contemporary Israeli literature, when you read it in the original, you find these kinds of references, half the time they're almost unintentional, because it's just sort of part of the language. And so what I try to incorporate into English is those kinds of references in those kinds of subtle ways where, hamavin yavin, and either people will notice it or they won't notice it, and in a sense I don't really care if people notice it or not, but it's something that's throughout the book, and the more important references are sort of explained in a sense so that a reader of any background can read this and understand the book, but there's there's additional layers that are built into the language. That they're not, and I don't do it as a game. I do it sort of as a way of rooting my books in a longer tradition that moves beyond this language in this country.
Well, I'll say thank you so much to both these writers. Truly a pleasure.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.